Hello and welcome to our latest story from the Strongrooms. This month we'll tell the story of Hull's development through some of our most iconic documents, Hull's charters. The loan of Queen Victoria's jewel cabinet by the Royal Collection has provided the opportunity for the Ferrans Art Gallery to tell some of the story of Hull's relationship with the Crown. It's fair to say that this has been a fraught relationship at times, notably the incident in 1642 when King Charles I was turned away from Beverley-gate. But for centuries, Hull obtained rights and privileges from successive monarchs, and in return was expected to render loyal service by bringing central government to the locality. These rights and privileges were enshrined in documents known as charters. Hull has about 40 charters, but isn't unique, of course, in having such a collection. Other towns and cities have older ones, Heddon for instance. We can use the charters as signposts by which we can tell some of the story of Hull. Hull's history is of course about more than its relationship with central government and the development of local institutions, but they are the context in which Hull's people lived and provide interesting background for our city's story. It's a long story, but it begins in 1299 with the Charter of King Edward I. But what is a charter? Formally speaking, a charter is a public document addressed by a donor to a wide audience recording title to a piece of property. The donor is by no means always or indeed often a king. Charters have a long history. Anglo-Saxon in origin, the earliest held at the History Centre dates from as early as 1087 and records the confirmation by King William II of a transfer of land in Normandy, northern France. In many ways, a charter is basically a title deed. By way of example, here we see two of Hull's charters. Edward III's of 1334, by which he extended the privileges of merchants in Hull, and that of Queen Elizabeth II of 1975, granting the continuance of the title of city following local government reorganisation in 1974. Superficially different, 630 years apart and in different languages, they share similarities of structure across the centuries. A charter begins with the name of the donor and a greeting to the audience. Both charters go on to specify what's being granted. There's often mention of the consideration, why the grant is being made. At the end of the document in the Middle Ages, there was a witness list. Lastly, in each charter, the dating clause. The dates are given in regnal years rather than calendar years. We're currently in the first regnal year of King Charles III. Both charters are authenticated with the Great Seal, cast in wax from a matrix and showing the monarch enthroned on one side and on horseback on the other. It's remarkable to see that, as with most of our charters, the medieval seal largely survives, still attached to the document by a cord of plaited silk. Charters were written with quill pens, usually those of geese or swans, and the ink usually made from oak galls, iron sulphate and gum. The finest writing could only be done by daylight. Mistakes were hard to put right. Charters were written on parchment, which is animal skin, usually from sheep or calves. Calf skin was called vellum, which means veal skin. The skin would be treated, stretched and scraped to produce a smooth writing surface. Even after paper started to be imported and then made in this country, parchment continued to be used for charters up until today. In the Middle Ages, a charter was a routine government document, but at the same time it also carried with it a sense of importance that was more than its legal status. This was a carryover from the early Middle Ages, when writing was rare, special and mysterious, even magical. A royal charter was a physical embodiment of the king and had to be treated with respect. While modern charters don't carry the same mystique, they're still impressive documents, and it's remarkable that the format of the modern document, from the greeting to the dating clause, has not changed significantly for 700 years, other than it is now written in English. That's the background, so let's turn to the 1299 Charter itself, Hull's birth certificate. In 1299, Hull was a recent acquisition by the King from the Cistercian Abbey of Mews at Warne to the north of Hull. The commercially minded monks had developed a small port in the late 12th century for the transshipment of goods from rivercraft to bigger seagoing cogs on their land at the mouth of the River Hull. Doubtless this was with the intention of furthering the wool trade. The original settlement was called Wick or Wyke upon Hull. In 1275 it became the local headquarters for collection of customs dues, and in 1279 the abbot was granted the right to have a market and fair here, the earliest reference to what is now Hull Fair. The customs records tend to refer to Hull rather than Wick, so we were Hull before we were ever Kingston upon Hull. By 1293 this was one of the most important ports in the north of England, prosperous enough to attract the attentions of one of England's most rapacious monarchs, King Edward I. Edward's acquisition of Hull probably had as much to do with gaining direct control of the lucrative wool trade of Wick as his need of a supply base in the north for his wars in Scotland. Once war had broken out in 1296, there is evidence that English armies in Scotland were indeed supplied from Hull. Mews Abbey, in financial difficulties, was made an offer it couldn't refuse, and Edward purchased the town, 55 occupied building plots, known as messuages, worth £103. The king immediately started to develop his new acquisition. Roads were built towards Beverley, Hesle and York. A new quay was built, and a grid of new streets and building plots was laid out to the west of the High Street. And of course he gave it a new name, Kingston upon Hull. And on the 1st of April 1299, King Edward I granted the town its first charter. Edward made Hull a free borough. Borough status was worth having. The inhabitants of the borough, known as the burgesses, were given some rights to govern themselves. They answered to a keeper of the town, appointed by the king, but they had their own courts and the right to sell or bequeath their property in Hull. The king granted Hull the right to hold a market 2 days a week and a 30-day annual fair. A right well worth having for the burgesses was exemption from tolls and customs duties throughout England. They could buy and sell goods much more freely. Even better, the burgesses could now control who else became a burgess. In return for these new rights and privileges, the burgesses of Hull agreed to pay a fine of £66, equivalent to 2.4 million today in terms of purchasing power. With the 1299 Charter, Hull was recognised as what it has remained ever since, a self-governing community. This identity has developed over the years, but in 1299 it was first defined. And it was, of course, a community which needed protecting. Following the defeat of Edward I's son, King Edward II, at Bannockburn in 1314, the Scots raided deep into Yorkshire, and Hull's exposed position, strategic importance and increasing wealth made it a potential target. To defend the town, Edward II issued a charter in 1321, giving the burgesses of Hull the right to fortify the town, to, quote, enclose the same town with moats and with a wall of stone and lime. Just in time, in 1322, an invading Scottish army inflicted a humiliating defeat on an English army at the Battle of Byland near Thirsk, much too close to Hull for comfort. In 1327, another charter was issued which authorised them to build walls in brick. Work probably began on the main gates of Hull: Northgate, Beverley Gate, Myton Gate, Hesle Gate, seen here in an 18th century engraving, and Watergate. When the new King Edward III visited Hull in 1332, he was pleased with progress. Once protected, the citizens of Hull were concerned to govern themselves as much as possible without interference from other agents of royal authority in Yorkshire. An important step forward in Hull's progress towards self-government occurred in 1331 with the grant of a charter by King Edward III. Edward III granted the burgesses the right to elect a mayor once a year, replacing the former post of keeper to which the king had made appointments. The new mayor was supported by 4 bailiffs. The mayor and bailiffs were to hear court cases and govern the town on behalf of the king. As the king's representative, the mayor was the most important person in Hull. He had far more executive power than his successors today, whose role is largely ceremonial. He enforced the law, and his attendants, the sergeants, acted as a sort of police force. Anyone criticising the mayor would be severely punished with heavy fines. The current office of Lord Mayor owes its origin to the grant of Edward III, and for over 680 years there has been an unbroken line of mayors and, since 1914, Lord Mayors of Hull. William Delapole was the first mayor in 1331. The River Hull, the old harbour, was crucial to the prosperity of the town. Legally this had belonged to the king, but in 1382, in a charter which doesn't survive in our archives, Richard II granted to Hull the lower course of the river. The all-important harbour therefore passed into the control of the mayor and burgesses. It is still the property of Hull City Council today. This, the first charter granted by King Henry VI in 1440, marked the final stage on Hull's road to self-government. The king incorporated the borough, giving it an independent legal identity. This is a status which Hull City Council still retains. Hull obtained an additional significant privilege. It became a county of itself. This meant that it was separated from the jurisdiction of the magistrates of Yorkshire. It could elect its own sheriff to replace the previous posts of bailiffs and hold its own courts to hear all but the most serious cases. Apart from York, Hull was the only county borough in the region, and until 1974, after having had the title of city conferred on us, the official name of the local authority was the City and County of Kingston upon Hull. Some of you may remember this. In 1440, the new county and the old borough were one and the same, more or less the area of the current Old Town within the newly finished town walls. But in 1447, Henry VI extended the boundaries of the county of Hull to include North Ferriby, Swanland, Kirkella, Anlaby Hesel, and the area surrounding the Priory of Halton-Price. Since 1402, Hull's fresh water supply had come from Julian's Well, where the old Springhead Waterworks stands. The water ran along a dyke and was later piped along the line of Spring Bank into the town. However, the monks of Halton-Price and the villagers to the west of Hull resented their water being taken by Hull and frequently attempted to disrupt the supply. In 1412, the Pope intervened in Hull's favour. It was not until 1447 and the extension of the county that Hull's control of the villages to the west finally secured the town's water supply. The extensive county of Hull, which was sometimes known as Hullshire, lasted until 1835, when the villages once again became part of the East Riding of Yorkshire. Here it is on Hargreaves' map of 1791. Late medieval Hull was eager to demonstrate its new status to the inhabitants and visitors to the town. Ceremony and civic displays of wealth and power were an important way of doing this in the Middle Ages. So, in a second charter of 1440, Henry VI granted to the town the right for the mayor to have a sword of state carried in front of him on important occasions. The sword symbolised that the mayor had been delegated the sovereign's authority. The aldermen were granted the right to wear robes trimmed with fur. In an age when power was demonstrated through dress and ceremony, these were significant privileges, and it's probable that Hull had had help in securing the honour from some highly placed people. The town accounts record that 200 marks had been paid to the Duke of Suffolk, one of Henry's leading courtiers and the head of the Delapole family, which still maintained a connection with Hull. Equipped with the charter, the town immediately bought a sword. No expense was spared. The surviving accounts show that the cost of the sword was £7 10 shillings and a penny, of which £4 7 shillings and 10 pence was for the silver gilt decoration. Some of this original decoration still survives. The sword of state is still carried before the Lord Mayor on the most important civic occasions, such as royal visits, another link between modern Hull and its medieval past. In 1443, Henry VI granted yet another charter, defining the way in which mayor and aldermen were to be elected. From then on, the local government of Hull was to be in the control of a closed group of powerful merchants. Hull had achieved self-government, but that was now to be in the hands of a self-perpetuating oligarchy. Membership changed, of course. Merchant families rose and fell, or more usually took their pile out to the East Riding and set up as landed gentry. But all those Daltons, Crolls, Listers, Wilberforces and Sykeses, the merchant dynasties which ran Hull for hundreds of years, were the direct beneficiaries of a system enshrined in the Charter of 1443. So here's Henry sitting on his throne under the capital H, looking the picture of the majestic and powerful monarch he really wasn't. However, his generosity continued, encouraged doubtless by the Delapoles. In 1447, in the same charter which extended the boundaries of Hullshire, he gave the mayor and aldermen the right to elect the Admiral. The first serving mayor to hold the office was John Dalton in 1488, and since then the offices have usually been held together. Now the Admiral of the Humber was a judicial office rather than a naval command. The Admiral had the responsibility of hearing legal cases in maritime disputes. The Admiral's jurisdiction was abolished in 1835, but the title remains an important link with Hull's past. As Admiral, the Mayor has assumed a ceremonial role towards visiting naval vessels. Only the Lord Mayor of London and the Mayor of Chester are also Admirals, of the Port of London and the River Dee respectively, and the prestige of the office was enhanced when a coat of arms was obtained for the Admiral of the Humber in 2005. Although these are letters patent from the College of Arms, and we wouldn't categorise the grant as a charter, it's a very splendid document nonetheless. We've taken the story up to the end of the Middle Ages, but Hull's history can be told through its charters into the 19th century, so look out for episode 2 later in the year.